History often remembers empires by their triumphs, their glittering capitals, their armies, their kings. Yet every so often, a moment appears when the fate of nations is shaped not by the powerful, but by a few hundred men standing behind crumbling walls, determined to hold their ground. This is one of those moments. A story not of conquest, but of resistance. Not of overwhelming strength, but of courage so relentless that it forced the greatest empire of the age to pause, bleed, and reckon with its own mortality. And it all began in the late summer of 1566. Late in the summer of 1566, nearly 40,000 seasoned Ottoman troops, soldiers who had marched across continents, advanced toward a small Hungarian stronghold so insignificant that most Europeans couldn't point to it on a map. Behind them rolled the mightiest war engine of the century, batteries of cannons, ranks of janissaries, waves of Sipahi cavalry, and the full weight of an empire that had devoured cities, kingdoms, and entire cultures. And standing in their path, barely 2,500 Hungarians, some knights, a few weathered veterans, farmers carrying old muskets, and aging soldiers who had survived wars their own children barely remembered. All of them squeezed into a fortress no larger than a town square. On paper, it should have ended in a single afternoon. The Ottomans possessed everything: numbers, artillery, supplies, experience. But what unfolded over the next month stunned not only the commanders, but the Sultan himself. The most powerful empire of the age was forced to crawl forward, paying for every foot of ground with blood. A tiny place called Szigetvár, Szigetvár in some chronicles, became the stage for one of Europe's most astonishing defenses. Most remember the last explosion, the final desperate charge, the fall of the citadel. But the real story, the one that explains how 2,500 men delayed an army 20 times their size, begins much earlier, inside the minds of defenders who refused the simple choice to flee. The siege erupted against the backdrop of the bitter Ottoman-Habsburg conflict, a struggle dragging on since 1565. The Habsburgs, clinging to their holdings in Hungary and Austria, were trying to preserve the remnants of a kingdom shattered 40 years earlier at Mohacs in 1526. That disastrous battle broke the Hungarian crown and carved the country in two, some regions falling under Ottoman control, others into Habsburg hands. Peace treaties came and went, but the underlying tension never faded. Both empires coveted the same borderlands, especially Transylvania, which the Ottomans regarded as firmly within their sphere. For the Ottomans, Hungary was the gateway to Central Europe. And for Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, Hungary was the final barrier between him and Vienna, the glittering heart of the Habsburg realm. But the campaign was not driven solely by politics. Suleiman was 72, old, exhausted, and plagued by illnesses earned during decades of campaigning. Imagine leading tens of thousands of men while your own body collapses around you. Much of the strategic pressure, therefore, fell upon his Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. The stakes were immense. Time was precious. The empire needed a swift, clean victory to justify the cost of mobilizing such a massive host. So Suleiman gathered a colossal force. Estimates range from 50,000 to more than 100,000 soldiers, along with 300 cannons. But numbers alone didn't solve everything. Feeding so many men, dragging heavy artillery across rough terrain, and holding morale together inside hostile territory created immense strain. And as the siege stretched from days into weeks, casualties rose sharply, supplies dwindled, and momentum toward Vienna evaporated. What was planned as a rapid triumph turned into a punishing trial of endurance. Now, where exactly was Szigetvár? Around 30 kilometers west of Pécs, perched in low marshlands crisscrossed by moats and natural waterways. It was a bottleneck, a strategic blockade right on Suleiman's possible route to Vienna. And it was built like a layered trap, the old town first, then the new town, and at the heart, the stone citadel. Surrounding all of it were man-made moats and marshes that transformed the landscape into an extension of the fortress. For the Ottomans, this meant one harsh reality: brute force wasn't enough. Each ring of defense had to be taken separately, a slow, grinding assault that robbed them of their numerical and artillery superiority. The fortress and terrain together created a deadly funnel where the empire's overwhelming strength meant little. At the heart of the defense stood Nicholas Zrinski, known as Miklós Zrínyi, commander of the Hungarian-Croatian garrison. He led roughly 2,300 to 3,000 men, a mere fraction of the Ottoman mass, but fiercely loyal and hardened by years of war. His choice to hold Szigetvár was both military and symbolic. He knew that this stand would echo far beyond the marshes of southern Hungary. It was a declaration of resistance against Ottoman expansion into Europe. So how did such a small force withstand an empire? The answer lies in engineering and terrain. The layered fortress, surrounded by swamps and moats, prevented any straightforward assault. Ottoman infantry and cannons could not simply march up and fire. They had to wade through mud, cross waterlogged land, and endure constant gunfire. This is where Ottoman engineering brilliance and suffering entered the story. Their sappers built gigantic causeways across the wetlands, earth ramps wide enough for artillery. Picture hundreds of men working under relentless gunfire, shoveling dirt and hauling timber while snipers picked them off. Their determination was extraordinary, but the cost in lives was enormous. Even once they managed to position their cannons, the results were disappointing. The sodden ground absorbed shock, the marshy earth hindered movement, and the fortress's layered walls resisted bombardment. So the Ottomans were forced to attack again and again, with infantry pushing forward while engineers rebuilt structures destroyed by defenders. Despite being outnumbered by perhaps 25 to 50 times, the garrison held out for 34 brutal days, from August 6th to September 8th, 1566. Nearly the entire Hungarian-Croatian force was killed, but Ottoman losses were staggering as well, between 20,000 and 30,000 dead. For a siege, these numbers were extraordinary. They proved that even the greatest empire of the age could be held back by a small, resolute force when the battlefield favored the defenders. Let's break down how those 34 days unfolded, stage by stage, because Szigetvár wasn't just a fortress, it was a three-layered trap built to bleed any attacker dry. The siege opened with the Ottomans clearing obstacles and hammering the first defensive ring, the Old Town. Think of this outer layer as a protective shell surrounding the real heart of the stronghold. The defenders resisted fiercely, forcing the Ottomans to unleash heavy artillery just to take a foothold on the outskirts. After nearly 2 relentless weeks, the Old Town finally collapsed under the pressure. But Zrínyi didn't panic. There was no chaos, no breakdown in command. He pulled his men back in good order, reinforcing the new town, the second layer, where the true struggle was about to begin. And the Ottomans were walking straight into a nightmare they didn't expect. The new town stood behind marshes, waterlogged fields, and a maze of moats. Ottoman infantry couldn't simply march in and overwhelm the defenders. They needed solid ground. To create it, their engineers began constructing enormous earth ramps and raised causeways, massive platforms of timber and dirt meant to bridge the swamp. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of workers shoveling day after day under constant gunfire as enemy sharpshooters picked them off. And every time the Ottomans got close to finishing one of these ramps, Zrínyi's men burst out of the walls, launched a sudden attack, set the works ablaze, and fell back before they could be pinned down. These surprise sorties didn't just delay the invaders, they inflicted brutal casualties on the sappers and the guards protecting them. Even after all this toil, the terrain still smothered Ottoman firepower. They had nearly 300 cannons, yet most of them couldn't get close enough to inflict real damage. And when they did fire, the swampy ground absorbed much of the impact. The guns roared, but the walls held. Still, sheer numbers eventually pushed the Ottomans forward. On September 2nd, the new town fell. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The Ottoman army was exhausted, morale frayed, and thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded. Inside the fortress, the defenders had been reduced to roughly 600 men, little more than a final, desperate corps. Everything now hinged on the inner citadel, the smallest but strongest part of Szigetvár. By this point, the fortress was half ruins, half smoldering battlefield. Food was almost gone. Ammunition was running out. No reinforcements were coming. Yet the defenders fought on. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening just out of sight, something the defenders could never have imagined. Around September 6th, Sultan Suleiman died in his tent, his body failing after decades of campaigns. His death was a political earthquake. If word spread through the camp, panic might erupt. Worse, rivals in Constantinople could try to seize power before the army returned. So the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, made a desperate choice. He hid the Sultan's death. He concealed it from almost the entire army. And that meant one thing. The siege had to end immediately before whispers began circulating. That urgency drove the Ottomans into what would become the final, crushing assault on the citadel. By the morning of September 8th, the stronghold was little more than a burning carcass. Walls were shattered, smoke coiled from the debris, and the courtyard was a chaos of bodies and rubble. The Ottomans tightened their ranks, preparing the last push. Zrínyi understood the end had arrived. Rather than die buried beneath the ruins, he gathered his remaining fighters, perhaps 600, some say fewer, and prepared one final sortie. Imagine the moment. Armor dented and blackened, clothing soaked by rain and sweat, faces smeared with ash. These were men who had fought every hour of every day for a month. Yet they opened the gates and charged straight into an army tens of thousands strong. It was defiance made physical. The Janissaries quickly encircled them. Zrínyi fought his way across the inner bridge, cutting through enemy ranks, until gunfire struck him down. Moments later, the last defenders were overwhelmed. Almost every man fell where he stood. But there was no real celebration for the Ottomans. Not after what came next. Sokollu had to race back and secure the imperial succession before word of Suleiman's death escaped. The fortress had fallen, yes, but the victory drained the Ottoman host and derailed the entire campaign. Vienna would not be attacked that year, nor the next, and never again by Suleiman. Yet the legend of Szigetvár grew larger than the military reality. What happened on the ground was, strategically speaking, a last, doomed breakout, heroic but with no chance of success. But within a few years, poets across Hungary and Croatia transformed Zrínyi's final charge into something mythic. Not a failed sortie, but a heroic stand against an empire spanning millions of square miles. Zrínyi became the embodiment of sacrifice, resistance in the face of impossible odds. Szigetvár became memory, identity, symbol. And then came one of the strangest political twists in Ottoman history. The most important event of the siege happened quietly in a tent. The death of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The same ruler who had expanded the empire across 3 continents died at Szigetvár, 2 days before the fortress fell. His internal organs were buried beneath his tent, and a turb was later commissioned by his son, Selim II. But the exact location vanished from the historical record for centuries. Only recently, researchers such as Dr. Norbert Papp have begun narrowing down the site of this lost imperial tomb, the only missing burial of all Ottoman sultans. But the real shock is what happened after his death. Suleiman died far from home, surrounded by tens of thousands of soldiers, including Janissaries notorious for erupting into mutiny during moments of uncertainty. A death like this could have torn the army apart. Looting, chaos, commanders betraying each other in a race to reach the new sultan. But none of it happened. Why? Because Sokollu Mehmed Pasha performed one of the boldest political maneuvers in the empire's history. He kept the Sultan's death secret, not for a day or two, but for 48 days. For nearly 7 weeks, he governed in total silence, issuing orders in Suleiman's name, maintaining discipline, preventing factionalism, and buying time for Selim II to secure the throne. He prevented generals from defecting, kept the Janissaries calm, ensured Szigetvár fell so the campaign looked complete, and essentially held the Ottoman Empire together while its sovereign lay dead in a guarded tent. It was one of the most remarkable acts of political crisis management ever executed within the empire. Afterward, the Ottomans stabilized. Expansion slowed, the empire shifted toward administration and consolidation, and Szigetvár became a hinge, where a military struggle nearly turned into political catastrophe, yet instead marked the beginning of a new bureaucratic age. On paper, the Ottomans won. They captured Szigetvár. But the numbers tell another story. Ottoman losses are estimated between 20,000 and 30,000, a massive toll for a single siege. To put it in perspective, that's the size of a medium European kingdom's entire army. And on top of that, they lost their greatest sultan. It was the kind of victory that leaves you questioning whether winning was worth anything at all. The entire purpose of the 1566 campaign had been Vienna. Vienna was the glittering prize, the western pillar of Habsburg power, and the dream target for Ottoman emperors since the days of Suleiman's youth. But after Szigetvár, that dream evaporated. The army was shattered, its commanders shaken, the strategic momentum gone. Vienna wasn't just delayed, it was erased from the war map entirely. In many ways, Szigetvár slammed the door on Ottoman hopes of pushing deep into Central Europe ever again at an acceptable cost. And Ottoman leaders understood that immediately. They had no choice. The casualties were too stark to ignore. Only 2 years later, after the dead had been counted and Selim II had secured his throne, the Ottomans and Habsburgs signed the Treaty of Adrianople in 1568. In effect, the treaty froze the frontier. It created a fragile, almost let's not do this again anytime soon, balance between the two powers. And that stability grew directly from the shock of Szigetvár. From that moment onward, under Selim II and guided by Sokollu Pasha, Ottoman strategy shifted dramatically. Fantasies of marching triumphantly to Vienna were replaced by a far more cautious approach. Instead of expanding, the empire consolidated. Provinces like the Boudin Islet were reorganized and strengthened. Administration took priority over conquest. And then focus turned toward a very different arena, the Mediterranean. Although the Ottoman army had been ground down at Szigetvár, the navy remained powerful and largely untouched. In the aftermath, it became abundantly clear that sea power wasn't simply advantageous, it was essential. By the early 1570s, this strategic pivot triggered massive naval confrontations. The greatest of these was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, an earth-shaking clash of dozens of galleys, roaring cannons, and tens of thousands of men fighting across the waves, its memory echoing through both Ottoman and European history. The irony is remarkable. A fortress in inland Hungary, far from any coastline, ended up shaping the future of Mediterranean warfare. Szigetvár didn't just cost the empire its greatest sultan, it forced the Ottomans to rethink what power truly meant. Sokollu Pasha understood something that not every Ottoman statesman fully grasped. An empire's greatest enemy wasn't always a foreign army. It was disorder at home. Endless campaigns were meaningless if the state that funded them was unstable. During his 15 years as Grand Vizier, Sokollu prioritized internal strength over outward conquest. He reformed taxation, enforced accountability on provincial governors, maintained unity among diverse populations, and strengthened the bureaucracy. He focused on stability, efficiency, and long-term endurance, recognizing that these foundations multiplied the empire's military effectiveness far more than any single battlefield victory. In essence, Szigetvár forced the Ottomans to confront a bitter truth. conquest was no longer enough. To remain a superpower, the empire needed disciplined administration and strategic flexibility. And through Sokollu's careful leadership, the empire adjusted and endured long after the fires faded around Szigetvar's walls. But Sokollu's brilliance came with a hidden flaw. It was irreplaceable. The empire functioned because of him personally. He could steady an army, manage political factions, and coordinate distant provinces with ease. But he built no system that could survive without him. There were no permanent structures strong enough to fill the void if he were gone. And the warning signs had already emerged at Szigetvar. The very necessity of hiding the Sultan's death for nearly 2 months showed how fragile the leadership structure had become. Imagine it, an army of tens of thousands, hundreds of miles from Constantinople, their loyalty hanging on the identity of the man seated on the throne. One rumor whispered in the wrong ear could have torn the army apart. Sokollu's ability to maintain control under such pressure was astonishing, but it was also a flashing red signal. The empire's stability was not guaranteed. It was balanced precariously on a single man's talent. Fast forward to 1579, when Sokollu was assassinated. Suddenly, every crack he had quietly sealed split wide open. Sultan Murad III, his successor, inherited a state whose administrative machinery could no longer sustain itself. In just 16 years, Murad cycled through 10 grand viziers, an almost unbelievable turnover rate. That kind of instability wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a sign of an empire whose policies, strategies, and long-term goals changed with every new face in power. The empire survived, but it no longer possessed the cohesion or direction that had once driven its rise. And this brings us back to Szigetvar. That siege, this small, marsh-choked fortress in Hungary, was far more than a brutal military event. It was a mirror held up to the empire, reflecting its strengths and weaknesses. On the battlefield, it showed the limits of raw power, where even a tiny garrison could force a massive army to bleed. Off the battlefield, it exposed the delicate balance of politics, bureaucracy, and succession that held the Ottoman world together. Sokollu's genius preserved that balance during its most vulnerable moment. But genius, by its nature, is not a system. Szigetvar didn't fix the empire, it bought time. It delayed the reckoning. It postponed the chaos. Because eventually, every empire must face the truth. Stability built on one man's brilliance is always temporary. Szigetvar was both a triumph and a warning. A reminder that power, even when immense, has limits, and that empires, no matter how vast, are fragile when their foundations rest on a single individual. Sokollu managed to hold the Ottoman world together for decades, but the story of Szigetvar reminds us that no leader, not even the greatest, can stop the tide of history forever.